Heads up, while I tried to keep them light, this video will inevitably contain some spoilers for the Bionicle story. If you have not experienced it for yourself yet, I'd highly recommend doing so before watching this video. I've heard there's a really cool website with all the comics and movies and stuff, made by a really cool dude, who's 6'4" by the way. Link in the description. If you grew up in the early 2000s, you probably know this guy. The red one. The cool Bionicle with the fire sword you'd see in a TV commercial every once in a while, and maybe even owned yourself. Bionicle was an interesting experiment, a toy line driven by an entirely original story, where the story was not merely a glorified ad for the product, but was meant to be an engaging narrative product itself, same as any other Brooker movie. Over its 10-year run, the Bionicle line released 4 movies, 29 novels, dozens of comics, and a whole lot more, much of it written by a man named Greg Farshtey, but we'll get to him later. First, for the established fans in the audience, let me ask you a simple question. Who is the true villain of the Bionicle story? If you're someone who's only vaguely familiar with the story, maybe you watched the movies as a kid or read some of the comics but never dove in too deep, you probably guessed the Makuta before the fact that I emphasized true like that made you reconsider. If, however, you're someone who's kept up with Bionicle since the franchise was put on ice, you can probably guess who I'm talking about. It's pretty common knowledge at this point that Velica, a minor character introduced in 2006, was being set up as the twist villain indirectly responsible for much of the conflict of the Bionicle story, as well as the true final boss to be fought after Makuta was defeated. This twist was never realized, however, as after 2011, Greg Farshtey no longer had the free time to continue the Bionicle story, and the serials featuring Velica's rise to power were prematurely cancelled. What's less common knowledge is the reason you probably guessed wrong, because Greg was actually planning on doing the secret twist villain thing twice. Makuta is not the true villain of the Bionicle story, and neither is Velica. The Earth Tribe is. No, not this Earth Tribe. This Earth Tribe. According to Greg, the Earth Tribe was an Agori civilization hailing from the jungles of Boda Magna. Despite not once being mentioned in the actual published text of the Bionicle story, Greg has stated that the Earth Tribe was ultimately responsible for the Core War and the Shattering, the cataclysmic events that set the entire story into motion. Greg has also claimed that the Earth Tribe had their own Element Lord, the Element Lord of Earth, bringing the total number of those to 7, a number explicitly contradicted by published materials. One Earth Tribe Agori, Terra, was planned to appear in the 5th Bionicle movie, but that was ultimately cancelled with the line as a whole. Given that the Earth Tribe is never mentioned in anything Greg actually published, and given that their existence seemingly contradicts things he did publish, well, I'm sure you can imagine there's quite a bit of debate around whether or not the Earth Tribe is actually canon, whether or not it could be said to actually exist in the world of Bionicle. There are an average of 20,000 words in each of the 29 Bionicle novels, and almost that many, at just under 17,000 words, on the topic of the Earth Tribe's canonicity on their BS01 discussion page. BS01 is the Bionicle wiki, if you didn't know. But let's take a step back before we dive into all of that and ask ourselves, how did we get here anyway? What is canon, and why does anyone even care?
Please sign to verify this is everything you've ever said.
This is absurd.
Sign this too.
Chapter 1. How we got here. Let's start with another ostensibly simple question with a painfully long answer. Who created Bionicle? For a while, this was actually kind of a mystery, apparently even to some of the people who were involved in the process. The clearest look we've gotten so far, though, comes from Alistair Swinnerton in a blog post published in 2015, and apparently amended in 2022 with some further clarifications. Bionicle was originally going to be called Boneheads of Voodoo Island, a concept dreamed up by writer Bob Thompson, toy designer Martin Reiber Anderson, and advertising artist Christian Faber. Swinnerton, eventually with input from Thompson, refined the basic concept of robots living on a tropical island into roughly the Bionicle story we got, assembling the first Story Bible, which was recently released on the Biomedia Project, by the way. Check it out if you haven't yet.
The key LEGO creators of Boneheads were Bob Thompson, who had become head of story, and Martin Reiber Anderson, then a mere toy designer. He very quickly became creative director, thanks to Bionicle. The third of the four official co-creators was Christian Faber, creative director of Danish advertising agency Advance, who created the amazing graphic look of the whole project. I discovered many years later, only in 2021 in fact, that the original Bonehead story also originated with him. I'd always been told it had come from Martin. In fact, the story I received came from Bob, via Martin, but it seems actually originated in an idea of Christian's.
Once Bionicle took off, Bob, Alistair, Christian, and Martin became the heads of the story team, which did exactly what it said on the tin, outlining the world and story of Bionicle going forward. But of course, there's one more name Bionicle fans think of when they hear the words Bionicle story, probably more so than any of the guys I've talked about thus far, and that name is Gregory Todd Farshty. Greg was the editor of the LEGO magazine back when Bionicle launched, and as part of that role ended up being the writer for DC's Bionicle Comics, distributed inside LEGO magazine. While Greg didn't write the original outline of the Bionicle story, nor was he even aware of where the story was headed, his was the name on the comics, so his name was the one fans thought of when they thought of that story. And considering that these comics were the most widely distributed comics in the world at one point, yeah, there were a lot of eyes on Greg's name. As time went on, Greg's influence within the story team seemed to grow. Alistair helped outline the Bionicle story through Mask of Light in 2003, but left shortly thereafter to pursue other projects. Bob stayed on until 2005, as did Martin, but once they were gone, the only person left from the era before the Story Bible was Christian Faber. The exodus of the original story leads coincided with a shift in how that story was told, which further solidified Greg's role as the de facto story lead in the eyes of fans. You see, until 2003, the Bionicle story was conveyed through several different forms of media, none giving you the full picture. There were animations, comics, games, both flash and handheld, in-universe newspapers, I guess. But with the first Bionicle movie on the horizon in 2003, LEGO apparently decided some streamlining was in order, and the Bionicle Chronicles series of novels was born. The first three were written by Kathy Hopka, expanding on the story of the Toa told in Greg's comics. You probably saw them at a book fair when you were a kid. Scholastic eventually wanted a fourth novel in this series, and so Greg wrote Tales of the Masks, consisting of 5 entirely original short stories. As Greg was already writing the comics that the novels expanded on, LEGO apparently decided he would be the best person to write the forthcoming Adventures series of novels, and so his became the sole name attached to this new, streamlined version of the Bionicle story. The final piece of this puzzle is engagement. While Greg has remained adamant that he was never in charge of the story, the people who were in charge didn't really talk to fans about that story. Greg, on the other hand, has been an open book since pretty much day one, answering tens of thousands of fan questions since 2003. These questions were often just clarifications about things Greg had written into his comics or books, but their sheer volume, coupled with the fact that they were really the only direct engagement anyone got from the story team, solidified Greg as the visionary behind the Bionicle story in the eyes of the vast majority of fans. And when Greg would occasionally expand on the lore of the franchise in these Q&As, or accept a fan's idea into that lore, well, that's where it began. That's when his word, the word of God as TV Tropes calls it, became the canon. The term canon is religious in origin, with the earliest concept of canon most of us are familiar with being the biblical canon. The Standard Bible contains 66 books, but many more have been considered for inclusion throughout history, including several more Gospels. These non-canon books are collectively the Apocrypha. Perhaps the best known today is the controversial Gospel of Judas, in which Jesus implies he's the son of a higher, true God, not the more bloodthirsty God depicted in the Old Testament, who's essentially just Lucifer, a lower god that rebelled against his maker. Before writing this video, I sent out a survey to the Bionicle community on this very topic, with the first question being, how would you define the word canon? Rather than just read you a textbook definition, let's look at some of the more interesting answers. The events within a story that are agreed upon as having actually happened, with the voice of the authors taking precedence before the voice of those who interact with the story. The set of fundamental information regarding a series/piece of media regarding its setting, characters, story, and its themes required for keeping consistency and being a very important basis for building more things onto them. Canon is effectively the same as historical consensus, whereas we understand how events took place through various sources, but it also might be understood that sources can be misleading or need some additional interpretation, which is why we might see different interpretations of the same villages in Imnog and Imnog 2, since they are told from two different perspectives. A collection of texts that are agreed upon to be factual. In the case of an IP, it reflects information that the license holder states is true to the story they wish to tell. There are multiple tiers of canonicity depending on how heavily the license holder is involved in the product, with supplemental and obscure media being less canonical than primary texts. The idea of having a canon is both easiest to describe and most useful when you have numerous authors contributing to one shared world or story. The best example of this may be the Star Wars franchise has two distinct canons. The Legends canon, consisting of all Star Wars media from before the Disney buyout, and the unhelpfully named Canon canon, which consists of the original 6 movies, the Clone Wars TV show, and then everything Disney made themselves. These two canons are almost completely distinct from one another, with the events of the Legends books set after Return of the Jedi having absolutely no bearing on Disney's sequel trilogy. Occasionally, Disney will bring over a well-liked aspect of the old canon, most notably this guy, but even those elements will often be reduced to their bare essentials and then built back up in some new form. Back when George Lucas was in charge, when the Legends canon was the only canon, well, there were actually already multiple canons. Or rather, there were different levels of canon, denoting how essential a certain story element was to the overall picture. The highest tier was G canon, for anything George Lucas made himself. C canon was the continuity canon for anything in the expanded universe, such as the numerous novels. S canon was secondary for older media that didn't really fit the shared vision of the later EU, and finally there was N canon for non-continuity, the stuff that blatantly contradicted important story elements and should thus be disregarded entirely. So now that we've more or less defined what canon is, how do we define what is canon? The Homestuck epilogues succinctly define canon like this.
The day we went through that door and claimed our reward, we passed a threshold between continua marked by differing degrees of relevance, truth, and essentiality. Those are the 3 pillars of canon.
So there we go. A pretty simple way of quantifying canonicity. Let's take these pillars and look back at something from Star Wars again. Say, Han Solo's death. We'll start with truth because it's the most straightforward. Han Solo's death is pretty clearly true, as the stuff that happened to him will kill a person several times over, and the subsequent media has all respected it. He didn't just randomly show up in, Season 2 of Resistance or something. It's definitely relevant to both the other characters and the audience, as some number of both are emotionally affected by it, and it's undoubtedly essential, as killing Han defines Kylo's mental state going into The Last Jedi, which leads to him killing Snoke, which leads to basically everything that happens in The Rise of Skywalker. So with all that considered, we can pretty safely say, it's canon. Sorry to any #real Solo heads in the audience, your man is dead. At least until he somehow returns. Let's compare this to something that's definitely not canon, like, as much as I hate to admit it, Skippy the Jedi Droid. In case you weren't aware, that red astromech droid that dies right as Luke's trying to buy him was actually Force sensitive, and he killed himself because he had a Force vision that if Luke took R2 instead, the Empire would fall. But is that really canon? Well, it's probably not essential. R2 knew he needed to find Ben Kenobi one way or another, and Ben knew Luke was the key to redeeming Anakin. One way or another, it probably would have worked out, even if Luke initially took home Skippy. Is it relevant? Again, not really. Did any of the fans or other characters think twice about this droid, and why he happened to die at just the right time? No, probably not. A bad motivator is a perfectly acceptable explanation for what we see happen. And finally, is it true? Well, his name is Skippy, supposedly. I think it's pretty clear this comic was meant to be taken as a joke. Sorry to any hashtag real Skippy heads in the audience, but your boy is not Skippy. He's just R4-D5.
Back you. Now that it is all over, I think I can finally say that. I love you.
The feeling is mutual, Hughie, but our love cannot be.
What is it, baby?
Our relationship isn't real, because Greg F. said it wasn't canon in the Bionicle storyline.
Are you freaking serious?
Perhaps no three words are uttered more between Bionicle fans than these. Love isn't canon.
Alright, so when Bionicle started, Huki and Maku, who as I recall were named Huki with a U and Maku with a C, back then, had some feelings for each other. Then there were hints of Jala and Holly liking each other. Then the subject was dropped. What happened there? Simply a path Lego cared less about, I suppose? The whole Bionicle romance thing was something that got inserted without the approval of the story team as a whole, which is why it was purely on the web. I never felt it belonged to Bionicle, and essentially refused to acknowledge it in my stories.
Perhaps no Gregism has ever been so controversial as the inescapable, the monolithic, love isn't canon. Only 73.3% of survey respondents said they value canon, and 55.4% said Greg should still get to dictate what is and isn't canon, but 76.9% insisted that yes, love is canon, regardless of what Greg says. Even the most educated of scholars, reigning from atop the knowledge towers of Kometru, cannot accept this facet of Greg's reality. Love is canon. But is canon even real? Chapter 3. Is canon real? So let's sum this all up in a way that makes sense. Canon is, essentially, the belief that some criteria, perhaps relevance, truth, and essentiality, define a correct way a fictional world works, and a correct way things happened in that world, and the literal words on the page can either be accurate or inaccurate approximations of that. Let's take a step back for a second. You could say that all written works exist along a spectrum, from fiction to non-fiction. At the non-fiction end, we have your average history book. It is, ideally, just a straightforward account of events that verifiably happened in the real world. A little further down the line, we have historical fiction. Stories like, say, the Titanic movie. Jack and Rose may not have been real people, but the Titanic was a real ship, which did sink more or less as we saw in the movie. Many of the side characters were actually real too, though their interactions with Jack and Rose specifically were obviously not. A bit farther down the line, we might have something like, Ridley Scott's Alien. The characters in this movie are humans from our Earth, but the whole thing is set in the far future. We have no idea if any events like this will ever actually occur, whether there will ever be a Nostromo, or if a creature like the Xenomorph even exists anywhere. Bionicle is all the way at the other end of this spectrum. It is pure fiction. Its world and its logic, its characters and their motivations, and all its events are made entirely out of whole cloth. There is no island of Matanui anywhere in the known universe, and a lot of the things that happen in this story don't even fit within our understanding of physics. So it's reasonable to assume these events never could happen, even in an infinite multiverse. So with all that being said, the concept of canon starts to seem a little weird, right? The canon events didn't happen, and the non-canon events extra didn't happen? How does that work? What does that even mean? If the Bionicle story is 100% fictional, shouldn't all the parts of that story be equally fictional? Some writers try to have fun with this discrepancy. Some SCPs, for example, most notably all but one of the SCP-001 proposals, are intentionally labeled decoy entries in-universe, to avoid making too much of a mess of the Foundation's already quite loose canon. Bionicle, however, does not do this, leaving any media not considered canon to just be disregarded outright. But why? Why does it matter if things that are already fictional have inconsistencies, or multiple interpretations of the same event or character? Let's dive a little deeper, and try to figure out why people care about this so much. Chapter 4. Is canon just death of the author? Le Morte d'Arthur is a 15th century compendium of stories concerning King Arthur. Wait, no, sorry, that's The Death of Arthur. Sorry. La Morte de la Tour, better known by its English title The Death of the Author, is a 1967 essay by Roland Barthes. This topic has already been covered extensively by others, so I won't dwell on it too much here, but basically Barthes believed that literary works should be analyzed and interpreted outside the context of any authorial paratext, i.e. outside the influence of anything the author said either about the text or not before or after it was published. Once the text is published, it is its own entity, and should be treated as such. In her video essay on this topic, Lindsay Ellis discusses several authors, but the one most relevant here is probably she who must not be named. The author of the Harry Potter series, like Greg Farshtey, has been an open book for years, answering fan questions about the lore of the world she created, and occasionally expanding on that lore unprompted, to mixed results.
Hogwarts didn't always have bathrooms. Before adopting Muggle plumbing methods in the 18th century, witches and wizards simply relieved themselves wherever they stood, and vanished the evidence.
Her gross idea of how wizards went to the bathroom is mostly harmless, but there is still a potentially insidious side to what's happening here. As Lindsay Ellis put it, she believes she's still the master of her universe, long after the Harry Potter series has been completed. When an author or fans think of authors this way, the words on a page are not just words on a page. The world described by those words exists, and the author is its host. Thousands of fans asked Greg tens of thousands of questions because, as far as they were concerned, Greg had the authority, in perpetuity, to define the world of Bionicle for them. I guess you could say the concept of canon, at least as the Bionicle community sees it, is the anti-death of the author, an immortality of the author. The author is the entity worth focusing on, not the text. The text is merely a facsimile of something within the author, something that can always be understood better. Any inconsistency in the world or story is not an artifact of the messy creative process, it's a misrepresentation, something for the author to correct later. Barthes believed this was a fundamentally wrong way to engage with a work of literature. The image of literature to be found in contemporary culture is tyrannically centered on the author. His person, his history, his passions. Criticism still consists, most of the time, in saying that Baudelaire's work is the failure of the man Baudelaire, Van Gogh's work his madness, Tchaikovsky's his vice. The explanation of the work is always sought in the man who has produced it. So I couldn't really find a good place for this, but I wanted to talk about it anyway. Remember a few minutes ago when I confused The Death of Arthur and The Death of the Author? That was actually an elaborate bit, because The Death of Arthur could be said to have been one of the first non-religious works concerned with the concept of canon. Thomas Malory took the disparate myths about King Arthur and Merlin and the Round Table, compiling and editing them into one cohesive story, creating The Death of Arthur. He basically did for King Arthur what me and Teraganuva and that anonymous guy on Tumblr all tried to do for Bionicle. Okay, where was I? Oh, right. Authorial, or should I say Arthurial, intent. Chapter 5. Is canon just director's cuts? If canon is a manifestation of authorial intent, perhaps the best known form alternative canons can take is the director's cut, a usually extended version of a movie more in line with the director's vision of what that movie should have been, usually before studio execs got their hands on it. And no director's cut is better known than the Star Wars Special Editions. The original 6 Star Wars films pushed the boundaries of filmmaking, pioneering advancements in visual effects that have shaped the way movies are made today. Lucas's fascination with the advancement of his industry was a double-edged sword, however, as every advancement he made would be retroactively infused back into his earlier works, and so the original Star Wars trilogy has been updated more times than I can count. George would sometimes change his mind about something multiple times, such as when he first updated Luke's lightsaber to have a bluer blade, then a green blade, then back to a blue blade. And how did people feel about these changes? Well, I think Harmy's Despecialized Edition and Project 4K77 speak for themselves. Lucas is undoubtedly a genius filmmaker, but his endless meddling with the classics he created has alienated a lot of his fans, and for good reason. In the original cut of Star Wars, Mos Eisley was a sad, sleazy dump because...
You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy.
But as Lucas got more and more comfortable with CGI, the Special Edition populated Mos Eisley more and more, turning it into a bustling metropolis filled with fantastical creatures getting up to some very goofy antics. And George's changes were not limited to additions. New CGI shots were implemented to replace some of the shots made with more crude methods, effectively erasing the work that went into these once revolutionary VFX from history. And let's not mince words here. The new effects are bad. The old ones were crude, yes, but the new ones are just ugly. All the new creatures running around Mos Eisley are very distracting. One of them literally lumbers between the camera and our main characters. And some of Lucas's changes actually affect the story, the meaning of the film. In the original cut, Han shot Greedo first because he was a ruthless criminal who, was about to have an arc, who slowly became a better person. And in the special editions, well, now he was just acting in self-defense. Han's original characterization has been sanded down, and it makes his arc weaker as a result. And for the Bionicle fans in the audience, I might be reaching a bit here, but this does sound kind of familiar, right? In the original ending of Bionicle Chronicles No. 1, Tale of the Toa defeat the Shadow Toa essentially through Pokemon logic. Tahu, Toa of Fire, defeats Shadow Gali, the Shadow Toa of Water, by boiling her. And Gali defeats Shadow Onua, the Shadow Toa of Earth, by eroding him with a blast of water. Greg, apparently, did not particularly care for this ending, and later decanonized it. In the Bionicle Encyclopedia, he states that the Toa realized the Shadow Toa were the shadows that lived within them, and defeated them by reabsorbing them. The actual prose of this version of events was later found in the leaked 2003 style guide.
We cannot reject these things, Gali whispered. We must accept that they are part of ourselves. Parts we wish did not exist, Kopaka agreed. But we are strong enough to master them. And master them we shall, Tahu said. With that, the Shadow Toa gave a mournful wail and began to break apart. In seconds, their substance had turned to mist, and the mist had vanished inside the bodies of the Toa.
Now, I would argue that Greg's version of events is the more interesting version. It gives some actual thematic weight to the Shadow Toa and adds some complexity to the relatively black and white morality of the 2001 story. But still, should Greg have been able to do this? And should we, the fandom, have accepted it? Why does Greg's word take precedence over Hopka? Who gets to Chapter 6? Who arbitrates canon? In the survey I sent out for this video, one of the questions I asked was, is there anyone else who you feel has/had the right to dictate what is/was canon alongside Greg? 69.2% of respondents said yes, with most of those identifying Christian Faber, Bob Thompson, or both as their anyone else. 30.8% said no, elaborating that either Greg should have sole authority as the main writer for much of the toy line's life, or that Greg shouldn't have any say at all anymore. I'd like to highlight one particular response before we move further.
It's an easier question when it's art as dictated by a singular artist. But given how decentralized Bionicle was as a project, even in the story department, it creates an ambiguity in whose word means anything. Greg having the longest tenure with the narrative certainly makes him the strongest candidate for dictating canon, and I think his role as an artist stands regardless of his employment. But, by that same logic, Alastair Swinnerton and Bob Thompson's inputs as writers and artists, even now, still hold water. And if they should contradict each other, well, I point you to Blade Runner, and how the director Ridley Scott and the writers Hampton Fancher and David Peoples have different ideas of what is canon within the story, especially in regards to the identity of their main character. In cases like that, pick a team. It's two valid interpretations of the canon as made by the different artists that formed it. Pick what works for you.
This answer was really interesting to me because it really struck at two of the core issues here. Who gets to decide what is canon, and why should the thoughts of one person matter so much? Blade Runner is a great case study here, as there are several versions of the film which are quite different from each other. The theatrical version of the film had a nice, happy ending mandated by the studio, while the director's cut and final cut end more ambiguously, in addition to including a new dream sequence that strongly implies the protagonist, Rick Deckard, is himself a replicant, the kind of artificial human he hunts for a living. Philip K. Dick, the author of the novel Blade Runner was adapted from, originally envisioned Deckard as a human. Harrison Ford also felt Deckard was a human, while director Ridley Scott has stated that he believes Deckard is a replicant. The sequel, Blade Runner 2049, was intentionally ambiguous on the issue to avoid upsetting fans of either interpretation.
The key to making Blade Runner 2049 was to be in between. The theatrical version is the story of a human falling in love with an artificial being, and the story of the director's cut is a replicant who doesn't know he's a replicant and slowly discovers his own identity. Those are two different stories. I felt that the key to deal with that was in the original novel. In the novel, the characters are doubting themselves, and they aren't sure if they are replicants or not. From time to time, the detectives are running scans on themselves to make sure that they are human. I love that idea, so I decided that in the movie, Deckard is unsure, as we are, of what his identity is. I love mystery.
Now, movies are complex productions, often involving numerous writers, numerous actors with their own interpretations of their characters, a director, an editor, and a studio that wants a movie that'll sell. What is and isn't canon in a movie can get messy very quickly. Bionicle, on the other hand, should be more cut and dry, right? Greg was the sole author for much of the story's written material, right? Well, yes, but he was still not the only creative involved. As we discussed in the last section, Greg's revised ending to the Shadow Toa fight essentially scrubbed Hopka's work on that part of the story from the canon. Did Greg have the right to do that? Well, did George Lucas have the right to erase groundbreaking special effects from the original Star Wars to replace them with fancy new CGI, just because he was the one called director? If Star Wars was a one-man production, then maybe he would. But movies usually aren't one-man productions, nor are they even principally the artistic creations of their directors in specific. If you want some solid evidence of this, I'd highly recommend Rocket Jump's How Star Wars Was Saved in the Edit. But suffice to say, Star Wars would have been a very different and probably much weaker film if not for the editing decisions of Marcia Lucas. So should George Lucas have had the right to alter Star Wars the way he did? I'd argue no, but if that's the case, who else does have that right? Who, if anyone, deserves the right to change a story after the fact, or alter how it's interpreted with new paratext? According to the survey I sent out, 55.4% of respondents said Greg still has the right to dictate what is canon, even though he no longer works for LEGO, isn't writing any new Bionicle stories, and has no official relationship to the IP. So why do people feel this way? All this talk about movies has me thinking. All these people who are obsessed with canon, all these people who want this work of fiction to be perfect and logical, I can't help but think of In the survey I sent out, 66.7% of respondents said they are the type of person who typically cares about plot holes, or other wrinkles in the internal logic of a story. If, however, you're only looking at the respondents who also said they value the concept of canon, that percentage increases to just over 70%. Now, I'm not a statistician, I can't tell you if a 4% increase is statistically significant, but I don't know, it's just interesting to me. You see it, right? The fixation on canon and the fixation on plot holes, on the anti-canon that warps a story into something you can't completely make sense of. They are two sides of the same coin. They're twin obsessions, a yin and yang. Anyway, why do so many people think Greg Farshtey should still be able to fill in plot holes, among other additions to the canon, even though he isn't actually writing this story anymore? Chapter 7. Is canon just another word for clout? For this one, we're gonna need some context. Competitions have been a major element of the Bionicle community since basically day one, with the Build Your Own Bionicle website contest being the first, way back in 2001. The 2004 Rahi Building Challenge is perhaps the most notable, however, as it was the first to offer a very particular prize. If your entry won, it would be incorporated into the actual Bionicle story. The grand prize winner, the Tatarok, later appeared in Bionicle number 21, Dreams of Darkness, while several runners-up were featured in the Rahi Beast Guide published the next year. These canon contests, as they were later called, became a mainstay of Bionicle's online community, with the concept even surviving the actual toy line's premature death. There were canon contests, on and off, until Greg Farshtey left his position at LEGO in 2022, with many focused on creating designs for characters that never appeared visually in the story. And since it's the internet, a lot of people had opinions about them. Pretty much every opinion you could have about them was accounted for somewhere, but particularly odd was the opinion that the entry should not have to adhere to the canon established in Greg's many Q&As, only the canon in the actual text of the story. This came to a head when it was time for the Toahaga contest, as Greg had stated in a Q&A that the 4 unseen Toahaga all had the same body design as the 2 we did get sets of, dubbed the Metru build. Second, and perhaps most challenging, is the fact that these characters are canonically Metru builds. To elaborate on this, Greg Farshtey has stated officially that the Haga look like their counterparts Norik and Irene, i.e. they share the same basic design template and proportions, henceforth to be referred to as a Metru build. As such, we plan to adhere to this line of thinking for these contests, and our rules will be built around that philosophy. Many people have expressed a desire not to enforce a Metru build requirement for the Haga, with the logic being that allowing for design freedom will lead to better mocks and more restrictions will lead to worse mocks. Unfortunately, while I'm never a super big fan of stifling creativity, Greg's word on the matter is pretty clear. At the end of the day, while I love seeing the outpouring of fantastic creations people make and want to do everything to support creative expression where possible, look at how hard we fought for 3D printed masks, for instance. At the end of the day, these are canon contests first, and mock/art contests second. If we create a rule system that produces something that flagrantly disregards canon, we'd be defeating the whole point of this system and just wasting your time and ours. I sympathize with the people who want the Haga to look identical to the other 2 on a shelf, I really do. I just think that crippling people's ability to creatively interpret the characters is a greater detriment to the contest than that problem is. Now, regardless of how you feel about the concept of canon, all things considered, this is a pretty weird position to take, right? These contests were judged by Greg Farshtey, so of course they were going to respect his vision of the canon. And moreover, if you don't care about his vision of the canon, why enter a canon contest? Why enter a contest where the only prize is the thing you don't respect? Forum canon. The obvious answer is prestige, clout. One option upsets skilled Machis who don't care about canon and or story, they just want another contest to enter and potentially win. Clout defined canon in a way. Greg had the most clout out of everyone on the story team, being the one who actually put pen to paper, and the one who most directly engaged with fans. He wasn't in charge of the story. Numerous people contributed to its direction, but Greg's clout with fans meant he was the one we entrusted with canon. He was the one we went to when we wanted to do more canon contests. That clout even extends beyond his tenure at LEGO, as a little over half of survey respondents said they still consider Greg the arbiter of canon to this day. And why do so many of us feel that way? Maybe it's respect for all the work Greg put into writing the story. But for some of us, such as the aforementioned subset of contest participants, it's because we want a slice of that clout for ourselves. If you need more evidence of this, just head back to BS01, where it's not uncommon for users to put a literal badge on their profile if they convince Greg to add their idea to the canon. Now, clout is not the only factor in determining who gets to define canon. There was one other factor that jumped out of the survey responses that kind of surprised me a bit. Who else should get to decide what is canon? Legally speaking, anyone that LEGO appoints to write continued story content since they own the IP. Ideologically speaking, anyone who writes a compelling enough story. LEGO still owns the rights to Bionicle, so whatever they say goes. In the minds of some, canon is simply a rights issue. Canon is most important when you're developing a new chapter of some story, after all, and the only ones with the rights to make that new chapter and publish it for a profit is whoever owns the IP. In the case of Bionicle, LEGO would be the sole rights holder, so that means they have the right to control the canon, yes? Well, maybe not. I was gonna say LEGO has a right to dictate Bionicle canon, but they don't even care about Bionicle anymore, so who knows? Fans, maybe? Obviously, LEGO is the only entity that can legally publish and sell new Bionicle media, but isn't that just another kind of clout? They have money and power, which gives them clout in the legal system? I don't know. Let's not go off on a tangent about what power means. When it comes to the issue of who gets to decide what is and isn't canon, I guess the answer is a thoroughly unsatisfying, it's complicated. Some Bionicle fans, myself included, attempted to formalize a solution to this issue with the tiers of canonicity, which explicitly define which materials get to override which other materials, with far more specificity than the old Star Wars canonicity tiers. Word of God from Greg overrides all, but the next most important thing is the actual Bionicle toys, which are the canonical appearances of the characters they represent. Greg's novels are ranked above the movies, which are ranked above their own novelizations, which are ranked above Hopka's novels. I do have a couple issues with the tiers, but they work, and they've been approved by Greg Farshtey, so there you go. There's a standardized way to handle any discrepancies in the Bionicle canon. Of course, the tiers are only valid if you accept that Greg's take on canon is valid, and the tiers being valid is presupposed on the acceptance of Greg's paratextual comments on Bionicle taking precedence above everything else, which is what the tiers themselves say. So the whole thing is kind of just a canon Ouroboros devouring itself one circular import at a time. Okay, I have to stop before my brain crashes. Who cares about canon, or director's cuts, or King Arthur, or any of this? We still haven't answered the most important question. At the end of the day, does what's canon even matter? Chapter 8, The Value of Canon. I haven't seen these messages myself, but I have heard tales of Bionicle fans complaining that they can't enjoy Motunui the online game anymore just because Greg doesn't consider it fully canon. And that's kind of sad, right? It's still the same Mnog you played before Greg voiced his thoughts on it, so why should those thoughts impact your enjoyment of it? Just because it doesn't fit one person's particular vision of how this world works, the emotional impact that story had on you completely evaporated? Why? In the survey I put out in anticipation of this video, 73.3% of respondents confirmed they do value the concept of a consistent canon, especially with regards to Bionicle. Now, I'll admit there might be some bias here. If I did not care about a thing, I would probably be less inclined to take a voluntary survey literally called the Thing Survey. However, many of the no respondents elaborated in the follow-up questions that they're passionately opposed to how highly the Bionicle community values the concept of canon. So, maybe the bias evens out. Maybe the Thing Survey is an equally appealing platform to those who love and hate a thing. As such, 73.3% was still a surprisingly high number for me, despite being neck-deep in the story-focused side of the Bionicle community myself. So there's clearly something going on here worth analyzing. Sure, all of this is completely fictional, but can some of it actually be extra-fictional? Is there some actual merit to the idea that some Bionicle media should be treated with more reverence than some other Bionicle media? Why do so many people care? And should you, my darling viewer, care as well? Perhaps no story can more succinctly answer this question than the one you all knew was coming. Because me talking about it was a canon event. Let's talk one more time about Spider-Verse. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is not just the best Spider-Man movie, don't at me. It is perhaps the most straightforward dissection of the concept of canon in popular media, with a specific focus on whether or not that concept is good, valuable. If you somehow avoided the onslaught of memes that erupted out of your local AMC in June of 2023, the story is basically this. Miguel O'Hara is the Spider-Man of the futuristic Earth 928, and the leader of the Spider Society, an elite strike team of the best spider people from across the multiverse, dedicated to keeping that multiverse from falling apart. In Miguel's mind, and possibly the mind of the multiverse itself, being Spider-Man is a sacrifice defined by particular, unavoidable tragedies dubbed canon events. The most obvious canon event is Spider-Man's uncle dying, something we've seen happen numerous times with every version of Peter Parker, as well as Miles Morales in the movie that preceded this one. This, by the way, is why the "what was his canon event" memes are dumb. His canon event was his uncle dying. The canon events are the same for all of them. That's the point. Miguel suggests that if these canon events do not happen to you, or even if you are just unwilling to accept them happening, you are not fit to be Spider-Man, and reality itself will make sure you aren't. Miguel attempts to subvert the canon himself, and the universe he tried to adopt is destroyed because of it. Miles saving the father of the girlfriend of another Spider-Man, that universe's Captain Stacy, starts this process in that universe too, as another of the canon events is...
A police captain close to Spider-Man dies, saving a kid from falling rubble during a battle with an arch-nemesis.
But why?
If not for Uncle Ben, most of us wouldn't be here, Miles.
That's pretty much it, right? In at least every incarnation I'm familiar with, Spider-Man becoming a true hero is motivated by his uncle's death. Spider-Man is meant to suffer because his suffering will make him want to do the right thing. If Spider-Man is not pushed to be the hero of the story, there is not a story. And so the universe, one of the many manifestations of the Spider-Man story, both figuratively and literally collapses. Spider-Verse essentially views canon the same way Homestuck does. What's canon is what is irreplaceable. If you change the canon, you change the story. You change what it means, and you change what the audience gets out of it. Jala's brief death in Mask of Light serves the same function as Uncle Ben's for Takua, motivating him to take a more active role in the world and push the story along. If Jala never died, Takua never would have put on the Avoki, he never would have faced Makuta, and the Matora never would have rediscovered Metra Nui. And most importantly for me, Holly never would have given that speech, which is one of the few moments in a work of fiction that has actually brought a tear to my eye. That's an easy one though. No Bionicle media has ever disputed Jala's death or its impact on Takua. Let's look at something more complicated where the canon has actually been disputed, or at least bent in a new direction, after the fact. Something like Vakama turning evil in Web of Shadows.
I'm listening.
Greg Farshchi has said repeatedly that he was opposed to the decision to make Vakama fall to the dark side in in Web of Shadows in 2005, to the point that there were apparently shouting matches between the story team when it was decided. The pro-evil Vakama side eventually won out, however, and in the movie Web of Shadows, which Greg wasn't super involved with, Vakama does seem to genuinely become full-on evil for a little bit, motivated by his numerous insecurities and constant beratement from his team, particularly Matau. Greg was not allowed to change the dialogue of the script for his novelization of the movie, which became Bionicle Adventures number 9, but he could more directly tell us what Vakama was thinking, and used this to get his way in the eyes of the fans. Rudaka and Vakama stood on the Colosseum balcony overlooking the ruins of Ta Metru. He was still not sure why he had followed her out here. Perhaps it was curiosity, a desire to know his enemy better. Or perhaps it was just a certainty that she would not have freed him if there were any chance for him to escape. Or perhaps he was genuinely interested in what she had to say? No, he assured himself, that can't be it. But another, stronger voice spoke in his mind as well. I am not a Toa, not anymore. And I was a failure when I carried that burden. Think about it. Do I really think 6 Toa Hordika and 6 freakish Rahaga can overcome hundreds of Visorak and free the Matoran? How many will die in that attempt? How many Matoran will never see the sunlight on the island above? Vakama tried to drive away these thoughts, but they just came faster. If I accept her offer, if I take the power that is being given me, I could order the Matoran to be freed. I could convince Rudaka to let the Toa Hordika leave with them and head to safety. And if it means I have to remain behind in Metru Nui, well, no one will miss me. Of that I am sure. Vakama made his decision then. It wasn't one the other Toa, or those old fools the Rahaga, would ever be able to understand. He knew that. But it would ensure their safety in the end, he hoped, and free him from the shadow of Toa Li Khan. He would no longer try to be something he was not cut out for. Instead, he would be a leader of a different kind. Vakama still does all the same things in the novelization. He still says all the same words, but his motivation is clearly different. The movie gives us no reason to assume Vakama's face heel turn isn't completely genuine, while the novel states explicitly that it isn't. Now, Vakama is pretty much my favorite fictional character of all time. I actually quite like the arc he's given over 2004 and 2005, as I think it's a surprisingly raw depiction of the ugly side of mental illness, something even media for adults often struggles with. I also think both versions of this particular chapter of that arc work fine, and don't necessarily contradict each other. It is easy to genuinely be an awful person, but still tell yourself that whatever you're doing is for the best. Still, we know for a fact that was not the intention of the authors. This movie and this book were not meant to tell the same story. The writers for both had visions for them that they thought were mutually exclusive, and both sides chose to execute their vision anyway. And if mental illness isn't something you've dealt with, you might not be able to read between the lines and see how these interpretations can complement each other. You might get very different messages from the movie and the book. Speaking of messages, let's talk about all the bad stuff you can do with the word canon. Looking back at Spider-Verse, it's pretty clear that Gwen Stacy is meant to be a trans allegory. When she's having the super difficult conversation with her father about her secret true identity, her walls literally turn into the trans pride flag. But for those in the audience who aren't fond of trans people, even subtext this overt is not good enough. Because it wasn't canon, anyone who interpreted it this way must be wrong, right? Gwen is literally not trans, and it's not transphobic to call people out for their bad thinking skills. Also, though, I don't get why OP hates the idea of Gwen being trans. Like, if she is, okay cool, but I very highly doubt she is. The character hasn't been written that way in any other iteration, so why would they start here? I don't hate the idea, just the fact that people try to say it's a fact she is. I have no problem if the creators say, yeah, she is trans, I think that would be fine. I was just curious about why some people are so hell-bent on that she is. But I also think it would be amazing to just create a trans spider person. I just don't think it would be cool to mess with this Gwen because she's been in 2 movies, and just shoving in the trans stuff would feel half-assed. Well, is Gwen canonically a trans girl herself? No one who worked on the movie has confirmed it one way or the other. But that shouldn't really matter. Gwen wouldn't have to be trans herself for her story to be a trans allegory, and even if it wasn't intended as one, there's nothing wrong with trans fans relating to her story and finding value in it for that reason. But subtext and interpretation don't matter to some people. All some people care about is what's canon, at least when it reinforces their pre-existing belief system. Takua's journey of self-acceptance and transformation into Takanuva is also interpreted as a trans allegory by a lot of fans, to the perpetual whining of a lot of other fans. Because, well, we later learn that Takua was canonically a Matoran of Light the whole time. Even if there's no way that was intended when the movie was released, as Matoran of Light wouldn't be introduced until 5 years later, it's canon, so your interpretation doesn't make any sense. So shut up, right? I think it's worth noting here that a refusal to accept any kind of allegory in a story because you don't like the message is very... well, you've got to be a little dumb, right? Of course Takua is not literally transgender, the Matoran don't even really have a concept of gender. For a thing to be allegorical, it must, almost definitionally, not be literal. Gwen Stacy not being canonically trans is what would make this an allegory. But if you become super hung up on the concept of canon and want to interpret everything super literally, then you flatten art out into nothing. If you only care about what's canon, stories aren't stories. They're not things meant to move you or make you see a certain perspective. They're just documentaries from a universe where radioactive spiders don't give you cancer. And that, in my opinion, is a pretty tragic way to engage with art. I don't love Bionicle because it's a story with perfect internal logic, because it isn't. I love Bionicle because I related to Vakama's struggles, because it moved me how he talked to Takua after I knew everything he had been through, because it's fun to see a dude surf on lava, even if lava is actually way too thick to actually surf on, because it was interesting to see a god learn to be a man. Works of art are not meant to be perfect encapsulations of perfect worlds. They're meant to be things that move you, in ways the mundane real world could not. For a Bionicle, that focus on creativity, not cold logic, should be even stronger, right? Bionicle is a Lego theme. Lego is all about creativity, about building your own stuff, about taking what someone else designed and remixing it. Lego, more than any other creative pursuit, is all about the cyclic nature of the creative process, of which destruction is an unavoidable part. So why, then, is the Bionicle community more focused on this concept of canon than pretty much anybody else? Why do we feel like we need answers to all these questions when the spirit of Lego would tell us, hey, come up with your own? Why do Bionicle fans, more so than any other fan community I've ever encountered, seemingly want to be told how all the pieces fit together? Chapter 10. Why Bionicle? It might seem like the Bionicle community's fixation on canon is oxymoronic, but I don't think it is. There's a pretty cool website some of you might be familiar with called New Elementary, which looks at each new LEGO set and lists all the new kinds of bricks in it, as well as any new recolors. And why do they bother? Well, I would say LEGO is an art form, and if you've seen some of the really crazy mocks, that's my own creation, that people come up with, I'm sure you're inclined to agree. But LEGO is a unique art form in that its limitations are overt and unavoidable. There are a limited number of piece designs, all of which come in a limited set of colors, and which only fit together in certain ways. So each new element, be it a simple recolor or an entirely new kind of brick, is a big deal. Imagine how big of a deal it would be for painters if the electromagnetic spectrum just randomly released a new color every once in a while. And maybe Bionicle fans are so inclined to dissect Bionicle and ask so many questions about it for a similar reason. The story spans over 100,000 years, but we barely see a year of that history up close. If you own more than one set, you could easily design your own character, and then there's millennia unaccounted for that you could fit them into. Maybe Bionicle fans are obsessed with canon for the same reason LEGO system fans are obsessed with getting new bricks. Every time Greg mentions some new idea in a forum thread, or takes a fan idea and says, sure, that sounds about right, it's another element of this world you could build your own story with. If you answered yes to the previous question, would you say that you value the concept of canon, especially with regards to Bionicle? Why? And if you answered no, why not? In the case of Bionicle, I believe canon serves best as a baseline for making your own creative adjustments and additions to, as opposed to something that should be adhered to at all times. The canon of the story helps me have a bit of an understanding of what would or wouldn't be allowed when I make my own MOCs and try to integrate them into the official story in some way. Is there anything else you would like to say about your views on canon? Whatever's been stated as canon should be seen more as guidelines rather than us being fully restricted by what's been said. Example, if something bad has been canonized, we should try working around it to make it not as bad as before, rather than completely ignoring it, unless it's something really bad. Okay, I think we've covered plenty of ground. We've pretty thoroughly defined canon and its relationship with authorial intent, and we've discussed the good, the bad, and the ugly of how fans can use, misuse, and abuse it. So what do we want to take away from all this? Well, let's see what the survey says, one last time. How would you define the word canon? All that is described as explicit truth by the original creators and all that can be derived, directly or indirectly, from it in its original spirit. The core of official lore of a series shared by the fans, preferably sourced in those involved in creating the series, and any individuals they trust to carry the torch of that legacy. I'd say canon would run off of official storyline, running alongside fanon which is written by fans. Is there anything else you would like to say about your views on canon? I genuinely deeply believe that fandom as a whole needs to move away from the current obsession with canon. I'm fully okay with fans putting value into preserving the original version of the story as the author intended from the perspective of keeping the original around and appreciated. But the idea that unofficial versions of a story are less valuable, or that alternate interpretations of the original can be considered false, isn't good for the stories we love. It just pits us against each other in unimaginative ways, and feeds into the idea that stories only belong to companies who buy and sell the rights to them, and that they can dictate our culture. Now, I don't know how you're feeling about canon at this point, but these were some of the answers I liked. Can canon be kind of fun to think about? Can you have a good time debating who would and wouldn't be revived on the Red Star? Absolutely. And I have thoroughly enjoyed talking about these things with the people who care. It's impressive how deeply some people want to understand this story they care about. It's impressive that there are people out there who basically know everything Greg Farshtey has ever publicly said about these books he wrote. Just don't take it too seriously. For some people, learning more about the canon can stoke the fire of creativity, and for others, it's a restriction on creativity. But what's salient here is that both of these outlooks are defined by creativity. Why did dozens of survey respondents say Christian Faber should also have the right to dictate canon, despite not writing a single page of the actual books? Well, because he's a very talented creative and the fans appreciate that. If there's one thing I'm taking away from the survey responses I liked, it's that stories, and the canons we define for them, are the product of an artist's creativity and a fan's love. Does Greg accept that Tahu once said, "Come to Daddy, River of Lava"? Probably not. But I do. I love it. And so it's going in the recommended reading order on Wall of History and none of you can stop me. Thanks for watching, and if you're tuning in on August 10th, have a happy Bionicle Day. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to me on Patreon. I'll put a QR code on the screen, I guess. And join my Discord server. I'll put a different QR code on the screen, maybe, and that's where I'll be releasing an Excel file with all the survey results, if you want to look at those yourself. So, yeah. like, comment, and subscribe.